letting the army choose the emperor. In 193 AD, the Praetorian Guard did something that would have seemed unthinkable a century earlier. They auctioned the Roman Empire to the highest bidder. After murdering Emperor Pertinax, who had tried to restore financial discipline to the Guard's pay, they literally put the throne up for sale in their barracks. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus outbid a rival and walked away as Emperor of Rome. He lasted 66 days before being executed. What followed was a year of 4 competing emperors, tearing the empire apart, with legions loyal to their paymaster rather than to Rome itself. The Guard's logic was not irrational by their standards. They had made and unmade emperors before. They were the most powerful military force in the capital, and they wanted money. The catastrophic consequence was that every ambitious general in every province now understood the lesson perfectly. The throne belonged to whoever had the sharpest sword and the deepest purse. Over the next century, Rome would cycle through dozens of emperors, most of them murdered, nearly all of them elevated by soldiers rather than law. The empire never fully recovered the idea that leadership should be earned rather than seized. Splitting the empire in half. Diocletian genuinely believed he was saving Rome when he divided imperial administration into 4 sections in 285 AD, creating what historians call the Tetrarchy. The empire had grown too vast for one man to govern effectively. Barbarian incursions were happening simultaneously on multiple frontiers, thousands of miles apart. A single emperor sitting in Rome simply could not respond fast enough. The logic was sound. The execution was catastrophic in the long run. What Diocletian created was a template for permanent division. Once Romans accepted that the empire could be governed by multiple rulers, reunification became a political struggle rather than a natural assumption. Constantine briefly pulled it back together, but after his death in 337 AD, his sons immediately carved it up again. By 395 AD, when Theodosius died, the split between East and West became permanent. The western half, poorer, more exposed, and increasingly reliant on barbarian soldiers, collapsed within 80 years. The eastern half survived as Byzantium for another 1,000 years. Diocletian's sensible administrative reform had quietly taught Rome how to cut itself in two. Hiring the people you were fighting. By the 4th century, Rome was doing something that would have horrified Augustus. It was filling its legions with the very barbarian tribes it had spent centuries trying to keep out. The foederati system allowed entire Germanic warbands to serve under Roman contracts, fighting under their own chiefs, maintaining their own customs, and owing loyalty to their commanders rather than to Rome itself. Roman generals embraced this because native recruitment had collapsed. Roman citizens no longer wanted to serve in the legions. The barbarians were cheaper, already trained, and genuinely effective fighters. For a generation or two, the arrangement worked well enough. Then it stopped working entirely. When Alaric, a Visigoth commander who had served Rome loyally for years and repeatedly asked for a legitimate military command within the Roman system, was denied the recognition he believed he had earned, he sacked Rome in 410 AD. The man who burned the Eternal City had been a Roman soldier. The legions that failed to stop him were commanded by men with the same background. Rome had outsourced its own defense to people who had every reason to resent the institution they were protecting. Letting Attila walk away twice. In 447 AD, Attila the Hun had just devastated the Balkans, destroyed dozens of cities, and pushed the Eastern Empire to the edge of collapse. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II responded by agreeing to pay an enormous annual tribute and surrendering a wide buffer zone of territory. It was humiliating, but it stopped the immediate bleeding. When Attila then turned his attention westward and invaded Gaul in 451 AD, the Romans and Visigoths actually defeated him at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, one of the largest battles in ancient history. They had him cornered. Then the Roman general Aetius, apparently fearing that a total Gothic victory would simply replace one threat with another, allowed Attila to retreat. The following year, Attila invaded Italy, sacked city after city, and only turned back due to disease and supply problems, not Roman military resistance. Pope Leo I is given credit for negotiating his withdrawal, which is a remarkable statement about how thoroughly Roman military authority had collapsed. Attila died in 453 AD of a nosebleed on his wedding night, which was either ironic or merciful, depending on your perspective. But the damage was done. Italy had been gutted. The Western Empire's remaining tax base was shattered, and Aetius himself was murdered by the emperor he had just saved. Stripping the western frontier to feed civil wars. Every time a Roman general decided he should be emperor, he did the same thing. He pulled troops from the frontier and marched them toward Rome or toward a rival. It worked beautifully if you won. If you lost, the frontier you had just stripped stayed empty. Throughout the 4th and 5th centuries, this happened repeatedly along the Rhine and Danube, the two great barriers that separated Roman civilization from the Germanic world pressing against it. In 406 AD, a massive coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed a frozen Rhine into Gaul in numbers Rome could not stop, partly because the troops who might have stopped them had been pulled away for internal power struggles. Within a generation, these groups had carved permanent territories out of what had been Roman provinces. The Vandals eventually reached North Africa, the wealthiest agricultural region feeding the Western Empire, and cut off the grain supply. Rome's civil wars did not just weaken the center, they physically opened the doors on the edges. Theodosius leaving the empire to his children. When Theodosius the Great died in 395 AD, he divided the empire between his two sons. Arcadius was 17 and governed the east. Honorius was 10 and governed the west. Neither was remotely capable of ruling, and both were immediately dominated by advisors, generals, and court factions who prioritized their own survival over the empire's. Theodosius had spent his reign holding the fractured empire together through sheer personal authority and military competence. Handing it to children was not malicious. It was simply the dynastic logic of the ancient world. You passed power to your blood. The consequence was that the Western Empire entered its most dangerous period in history without a functioning government. Honorius famously spent the sack of Rome in 410 AD safe behind the walls of Ravenna. When a messenger reportedly told him Rome had perished, he panicked because he thought they meant his pet chicken, also named Rome. The story may be apocryphal, but it captures something true about the man who presided over the fall of the Eternal City. Devaluing the currency until it meant nothing. The Roman economy ran on silver. Soldiers were paid in silver. Taxes were collected in silver. Trade across the empire was denominated in silver. When emperors in the 3rd century began running out of actual silver to mint coins, they did what desperate governments always do. They cheated. They reduced the silver content of coins while keeping the face value the same. Under Nero, the denarius was about 90% silver. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s AD, it was roughly 2% silver wrapped around a bronze core. Merchants were not fooled. Prices rose dramatically to compensate for the worthless currency flooding the market. Soldiers, who were technically receiving the same pay, were receiving far less actual value. Tax collection became chaotic because no one agreed on what money was worth anymore. Diocletian tried to fix this with the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD, setting legal price ceilings across the empire. Merchants simply stopped selling rather than accept the controlled prices, which made shortages worse. The financial rot that started as a short-term fix for military payroll ended up corroding the economic foundation that held the entire administrative structure together. Abandoning Rome for safer cities. Rome, the city, had been the symbolic and administrative heart of an empire for 700 years. Then, emperors stopped living there. Diocletian governed from Nicomedia in modern Turkey. Constantine built an entirely new capital at Constantinople. Honorius moved the western court to Ravenna, tucked safely behind marshes on the Adriatic coast. Each decision made practical sense. Constantinople controlled the strategic crossroads between Europe and Asia. Ravenna was genuinely difficult to besiege. Rome itself sat in the middle of a peninsula, far from every major frontier, expensive to supply and increasingly difficult to defend. But the abandonment of Rome sent a message throughout the empire that proved impossible to unsend. The city that had defined Roman identity, that had given the civilization its name, its mythology, and its sense of permanence, was no longer worth protecting. When Alaric sacked it in 410 AD, the psychological shock across the Roman world was profound, not because Rome was still the political center, but precisely because it was not. The Eternal City had been left behind, and everyone knew it.
Relying on one general to hold everything together. By the 430s and 440s AD, the entire Western Roman military apparatus had effectively collapsed into one man. Flavius Aetius, sometimes called the last of the Romans, was holding the Western Empire together through personal relationships with barbarian leaders, political maneuvering, and genuine military talent. He had no system behind him, no reliable institutions, no deep bench of capable commanders. When Emperor Valentinian III murdered Aetius with his own hands in 454 AD, reportedly jealous of his power, a senator present at the killing reportedly told the emperor that he had just cut off his right hand with his left. Within a year, Valentinian himself was assassinated by soldiers loyal to Aetius. Within 22 years, the Western Roman Empire was gone. The last emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 AD by Odoacer, a barbarian commander who did not even bother claiming the title of emperor. He simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and told them one emperor was enough. A civilization that had lasted 1,000 years ended not with a battle, but with a bureaucratic letter and a teenager sent into comfortable exile.